Talk to me. Talk to me.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Gersten, host of Chatting with History, where you can listen in to conversations I have with some of the most famous characters in the history of Western civilization. And today's guest is no exception. It's Elizabeth I, Queen Regent of England and Ireland. Considered by some as a charismatic figure and dogged survivor, her reign is referred to as the Elizabethan era, famous for the flourishing of English drama and for the seafaring prowess of English adventurers. So without further delay, let's meet Elizabeth I. Your Majesty, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan. It is a pleasure to be here today. When you contacted me to be on your show, I was quite flattered, as no one seems to be calling on me these days. And please, call me Liz. Since the time of my reign, I have let my hair down and become a much more independent and liberated woman.
Liz it is. As is customary, why don't we begin with you telling us of your childhood?
Love to, though it was not the most pleasant of times. Let us see. I was born at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, England, on the banks of the River Thames, downstream from London on the 7th of September in 1533. My father was King Henry VIII, and my mother, Anne Boleyn, was his second wife. I was the second child of my father to survive infancy, the first being my half-sister Mary, whom my father had with Catherine of Aragon, his first wife.
You know, before we go on, I think now would be a good time to give our audience a little background on your father, Henry VIII, who was the second monarch of the Tudor dynasty, succeeding his father, Henry VII, in 1509. Your father was the third child and second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, was about 5 years older than your father and heir to the throne.
That is correct. When Arthur was 2 years old, a marriage was arranged for him with the then 3-year-old Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, who, by the way, were the rulers for whom Columbus sailed. This arranged marriage was a way for my grandfather, Henry VII, to strengthen his kingdom against France and its potential support for pretenders to his throne.
Yes, you know, many royal marriages were the result of arrangements made for political purposes and often involved young children. Anyhow, the betrothed didn't meet until Arthur was 15 and when Catherine arrived in England from Spain. They married in November of 1501, 10 days after first meeting.
Yes, not like today, when many couples test drive a marriage by living together as a way to see if, should they eventually get married, it will last.
As it turns out, the marriage of Arthur and Catherine didn't last. Did it?
No, it did not, but not because they did not test drive it. Rather, in April of 1502, after about 5 months of marriage, Arthur died.
And what became of Catherine?
Well, once it was determined that Catherine was not carrying Arthur's child, my father, who was Duke of York, was made Prince of Wales, and my grandfather applied for a papal dispensation for her to marry my father as a continuation of the peace treaty between Spain and England.
On December 26, 1503, Pope Julius II authorized the marriage between your father, who was then 12.5 years of age, and Catherine, who was then 18 years old. And on the 11th of June, 1509, your father, who had just acceded to the throne, and days short of his 18th birthday, well, he married Catherine, a marriage that lasted 24 years, until it was declared invalid, largely so that your father could marry your mother and hopefully sire a male heir to the throne.
Yes. During my father's marriage to Catherine, she was pregnant a total of 6 times and gave birth to 3 males and 3 females, but only one, my half-sister Mary, survived, having been born in 1516.
It's reported that during his marriage to Catherine, your father had several mistresses and a number of affairs.
Men, they just cannot keep it in their pants, now can they?
Well, I mean, some men can, just not your father. You know, perhaps to ensure a male heir, he bedded a number of women, and one of his mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, had an illegitimate son named Henry Fitzroy. And shortly after his birth, it's reported that your father ended his relationship with Blount and began one with Mary Boleyn, your mother's sister.
Seems it was hard for the Boleyn women to resist my father's charms. Plus, he was king now, was he not?
Yes, he was. Anyhow, with Mary, who by the way was Catherine's lady-in-waiting, he supposedly fathered 2 children, Catherine and Henry Carey, though this has never been substantiated.
Rumors! There will always be rumors.
That is true. And conspiracy theories too. Anyhow, as time went on, and as your father grew more impatient with his wife's inability to produce a male heir, his attention turned to your mother.
That it did. My mother was a charismatic woman in Catherine's entourage, and in 1526, while still married to Catherine, my father began his pursuit of her, attempting to seduce her as he did her older sister Mary.
But your mother reportedly resisted his advances.
Yes, she was not as easy as was her sister, and having her became an obsession of my father's, leading to his desire to have his marriage to Catherine annulled.
Yes, and he devoted much attention to figuring out how he could do that. In 1527, some believe your father came to the conclusion that he should never have been allowed to have married his brother's wife, at least not according to interpretation of the book of Leviticus, and that the church, in allowing him to do so, had erred.
Yes, father sent his secretary, a William Knight, to appeal directly to the Holy See, but the Pope was not swayed to annul the marriage.
And this would mark the beginning of your father's break with the Catholic Church.
That is true. Most people associate England becoming a Protestant nation with my father, and do not remember that at one time he was a devout and well-informed Catholic, having published in 1521 Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which earned him the title of Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X.
You know, guess in some regards, your mother was responsible for your father losing his religion.
Yes. Not the first time, nor the last, that a man would lose his faith because of a woman.
And perhaps a reason why so many men, especially those claiming to be men of faith, appear to be warring on women and attacking their rights in the 21st century. Anyhow, and long story short, your father and mother publicly married in London on January 25th, 1533. And 5 months later, on May 23rd, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, declared the marriage of Henry and Catherine null and void.
5 days later, on May 28th, Cranmer declared the marriage of my parents to be valid, and on June 1st, my mother was crowned Queen Consort.
And, if we've been paying attention, you were born slightly prematurely on September 7th of that year and christened Elizabeth in honor of both grandmothers, Elizabeth of York, your father's mother, and Elizabeth Howard, your mother's mother.
Yes, and at the time of my birth, I was heiress presumptive to the throne of England, as my older half-sister Mary had lost her position as a legitimate heir when the marriage between her mother and our father was annulled.
But that ascendancy was short-lived, as when you were about 2.5 years of age, your father had your mother executed. You were declared illegitimate, and 11 days after your mother's death, he married Jane Seymour.
After I was born, my mother had 3 miscarriages, and my father, just as he had with his first wife in courting my mother, openly began courting Jane.
You know, seems your father was quite the lecher.
Tell me about it. Still, he was my father.
Anyhow, you know, back to your mother.
Well, 3 years of marriage with no male heir was just too much for my father to handle, but he could not just have the marriage annulled as he had with his marriage to Catherine. So he had my mother investigated for high treason and other charges, which included adultery, incest, and witchcraft. She was found guilty on May 15th, 1536, and beheaded 4 days later.
And 1 day later, your father was betrothed to Jane Seymour and married her 10 days after that. I mean, seriously, your father was not a nice guy.
Yes, but he was king, and my father. When I eventually became queen, my mother was venerated as a martyr and heroine of the English Reformation, being instrumental in my father declaring his independence from Rome.
Meanwhile, back to Jane Seymour. In early 1537, she became pregnant, and on the 12th of October that year, gave birth to a son, the coveted male heir, the future King Edward VI of England. 12 days after the birth, she died from complications related to it.
Yes, for who knows how long my father and she would have remained married, or how long she would have lived before he had her killed. Regardless, my father had 3 more wives: Anne of Cleves, whose marriage to my father was annulled; Catherine Howard, my mother's first cousin, who was beheaded justifiably because of adultery; and lastly, Catherine Parr, who helped my father reconcile with my half-sister Mary and I, resulting in the 2 of us being put back in the line of succession after Edward.
In 1547, your father died at the age of 55 years and was buried in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour.
Yes, and upon his death, the crown was inherited by his 9-year-old son, who became Edward VI.
Well, you know, I think we've pretty much educated our audience on the life of your father in order to give them a perspective on the family and times into which you were born. So, I mean, why don't we talk more about your childhood?
That would be fine. My first lady mistress was Margaret Bryan, who cared for my older half-sister Mary before tending to me. In 1537, she turned responsibility for me over to Blanche Herbert, Lady Troy, when my half-brother Edward became her new charge. While Blanche Herbert remained my lady mistress until she retired when I was 12 years old, Catherine Champernowne, better known by her married name as Catherine Cat Ashley, was appointed my governess in 1537 and remained my friend until her death some 28 years later in 1565. Under her tutelage and that of several tutors, I received a formal education and became fluent in a number of languages.
Yes, it is said that by the time your formal education ended in 1550, that you were one of the best educated women of your generation.
Perhaps. But while I was formally educated, I was not what you might call wise in the ways of men.
What do you mean?
After my father died and Edward VI became king, Catherine Parr, my father's last wife, married Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, and they took me into their household. There I was emotionally abused by Seymour, who engaged in what was referred to as romps and horseplay with me when I was 14 years of age, and which included his entering my bedroom in his nightgown, tickling me and slapping me on the buttocks.
Really? What a child molester. Why, you know, he'd be arrested in this day and age. Well, assuming he wasn't a Catholic priest. Anyhow, you know, please go on.
Well, what made it worse was that Catherine Parr knew of this, and rather than confront her husband over this inappropriate behavior, she sometimes joined in.
You know, seems a lot of nobility in jolly old England was nothing more than a bunch of sexual perverts. You know, so what happened?
Well, after Parr caught her husband and me in an embrace, I was sent away.
And what became of Seymour and Parr?
In September of 1548, Catherine died after childbirth, and upon her death, Seymour renewed his attentions toward me, intent on marriage. That was viewed as an attempt on his part to overthrow his brother Edward, who, by the way, was Lord Protector of England during the minority of his nephew, my half-brother, King Edward VI. An interrogation was held, resulting in Thomas being beheaded in March of 1549.
My lord, I mean, sure was a lot of off with their heads in those days. Anyhow, in July 1553, your half-brother, King Edward VI, died, and his will swept aside the Succession to the Crown Act of 1543, excluded both your half-sister Mary and you from succession, and declared as his heir Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of your father's sister Mary.
That was short-lived. Lady Jane was indeed proclaimed queen by the Privy Council, but her support quickly crumbled. She was deposed after 9 days, and in February of 1554, she herself was beheaded.
When Lady Jane was deposed, it said that Mary rode triumphantly into London with you by her side.
Yes, that is true. But this show of solidarity between us did not last long. Queen Mary I was a devout Catholic, and she was determined to crush the Protestant faith in which I had been educated, going so far as to order everyone to attend Catholic Mass. Her popularity ebbed even further when she announced plans to marry Prince Philip of Spain, an active Catholic, leading many to look to me as a focus for their opposition to Mary's religious policies.
In January and February of 1554, a popular uprising known as Wyatt's Rebellion broke out, arising out of concern of Queen Mary I's determination to marry Philip. And while Mary's overthrow was not expressly stated as a goal of the rebellion, it sure seemed to be implied.
Perhaps. Some believe the reason was wanting Mary to have an English husband, thus ensuring that England would not be ruled over by a foreigner. Others believe it had to do with religion, as all the rebel leaders were committed Protestants. Regardless, when it was suppressed, I was brought to court and interrogated regarding my role.
And you were imprisoned in the Tower of London. I mean, despite fervently protesting your innocence.
Fortunately for me, Lord Paget and other supporters of mine in the government persuaded Mary to spare me in the absence of hard evidence, even though other powerful people wanted me put on trial or executed.
Well, I mean, it's fortunate for Chatting with History as well, as we might not then have your story for you to tell us.
Again, I am thankful to be here. To continue, I was moved from the Tower to Woodstock, where I spent almost a year under house arrest.
Woodstock! You know, I didn't make the original event, but I was there for its 25th anniversary in 1994.
What are you talking about?
Never mind. You know, just reminiscing. But now I have a Crosby, Stills and Nash song in my head. By the time we got to Woodstock, we were anyhow. You know, so, I mean, you were under house arrest in Woodstock for about a year.
Yes. In April of 1555, I was recalled to court to attend the final stages of Queen Mary's apparent pregnancy.
And, as it turned out, Mary was not pregnant. Further, it appeared that she could never have a child, you know, which seemed to assure that you would succeed her should she die.
Sure seemed that way. And in anticipation of that possibility, her husband, who had ascended to the Spanish throne in 1556 and was now King Philip, sought to cultivate my favor, especially since my rival for the crown was my cousin Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a granddaughter of my father's older sister Margaret, and seen by Catholics as heir since they still viewed me as illegitimate.
Yes. I mean, this was a classic case of European politics, with Spain presently an ally of England, and Philip the husband of Queen Mary, and with Mary, Queen of Scots, betrothed to the Dauphin of France, who would become King Francis II of France.
Yes, there was no way Spain was going to let France have access to the English crown. So, when Queen Mary fell ill in 1558, Philip sent an emissary to consult with me at Hatfield, where I'd been staying, and on November 6th of that year, Mary recognized me as her heir. She died 11 days later, and I succeeded to the throne at the age of 25 years.
It's said that upon Mary's death, that you declared your intention to your council and to other peers who had come to Hatfield to swear allegiance, at which time you gave a speech expressing adoption of the medieval political theology of two bodies, the body natural and the body politic. I mean, do you recall the speech?
Of course. I said, "My lords, the law of nature moves me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that has fallen upon me makes me amazed, and yet, considering I am God's creature, ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have assistance of his grace, to be the minister of his heavenly will in this office now committed to me. And as I am but one body naturally considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern, so shall I desire you all to be assistant to me, that I with my ruling and you with your service may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort to our posterity on earth. I mean to direct all my actions by good advice and counsel."
You know, I must say, that's truly impressive, especially given that you were just 25 years of age and without a speechwriter.
Thank you.
It's recorded that as your journey from Hatfield to London wound through the city on the eve of your coronation ceremony, that you were wholeheartedly welcomed by citizens and greeted by orations and pageants, and that your open and gracious responses made you their darling.
Oh, it was such fun and quite an honor.
On the 15th of January, 1559, you were crowned and anointed by the Catholic Bishop of Carlisle in Westminster Abbey, after which you were presented for the people's acceptance amidst a deafening noise of organs, fifes, trumpets, drums, and bells.
That, too, was a lot of fun, but I do have to admit that it was quite noisy and gave me a royal headache.
Speaking of royal headaches, when you ascended the throne, you were immediately confronted by two major issues: an ongoing war with France, which proved to be a tremendous drain on the royal coffers, and great tension between different religious factions, especially since Mary had worked to restore England to Roman Catholicism by any means necessary.
Yes, my half-sister had some of my father in her, the part that was bloodthirsty and not very nice. It is said that she ordered the execution of 300 or so Protestants, with many burned at the stake, and that it earned her the nickname Bloody Mary.
Yeah, and here I was thinking Bloody Mary was a spicy alcoholic drink made with vodka, tomato juice, and a celery stalk.
What are you talking about?
Never mind. Just thinking about hitting a bar or two after the show. Anyhow, how did you deal with the religious issue?
Well, unlike Mary, I was a Protestant. However, I liked some of the elements of Catholicism, like the crucifix, and downplayed some Protestant elements, like the emphasis they place on sermons. And when it came to public policy, I favored pragmatism in dealing with religious issues. I am quoted as saying, "There is one Christ Jesus, one faith, the rest is dispute over trifles." Still, I and my advisors perceived the threat of a Catholic crusade against heretical England.
Heretical England?
Again, Catholics viewed me as illegitimate, never having recognized the marriage of my parents. I therefore sought a Protestant solution that would not offend Catholics too greatly while addressing the desire of English Protestants. As a result, the Parliament of 1559 started to legislate for a church based on Protestant settlement of my half-brother, King Edward VI, with the monarch as its head, but with many Catholic elements such as priestly vestments.
And what about the Puritans? A relatively radical group of Protestants who were pushing for reforms far more reaching than what you were advocating.
What a pain in the royal ass those Puritans were! An intolerant bunch of anal radicals who advocated greater purity of worship and doctrine, as well as personal and group piety. Why, some even advocated for separation from all other Christians. As it turned out, when we did not heed their demands, many of their congregations immigrated to the Netherlands and later to New England.
Yes, they came to New England. And now it seems in 21st century America that they're alive and well and still seeking to impose their radical religious views on others.
Better you than us.
Yeah, thanks for nothing.
Whatever. Anyhow, the House of Commons strongly backed the proposals that I and my advisers had made, but it ran into opposition in the House of Lords, particularly from the bishops.
Not so unlike the U.S. Congress of today and the past 3 or so years, where legislation passed in the Senate runs into opposition in the House of Representatives. So, what happened?
Fortunately, many of the bishoprics were vacant at the time, including the Archbishopric of Canterbury. This enabled supporters of mine in the House of Lords to outvote those who opposed it. And
on May 8th, 1559, a new act of supremacy became law, and all public officials were to swear an oath of loyalty to the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England, or risk disqualification from office. In addition, heresy laws were repealed in order to avoid a repeat of the persecution of dissenters practiced by Mary.
Also, at the same time, a new Act of Uniformity was passed, which made attendance at church and the use of an adapted version of the 1552 Book of Common Prayer compulsory, though the penalties for failure to attend and conform were not extreme.
Wow. You know, sure glad that in the U.S. there's freedom of religion and separation of church and state. Though there sure appear to be many, probably today's Puritans, who while wanting the state to stay out of their religious beliefs and practices, would like to impose their restrictive views on greater society. Anyhow, what was the war with France that you inherited about?
In 1556, while Mary was still queen, French King Henry II joined with Pope Paul IV in a war against Spain, an alliance that pushed Mary toward supporting her husband Philip. And while she initially resisted joining the conflict, things changed in 1557 when Thomas Stafford, a Protestant exiled in France, rebelled against Mary and what he perceived as increased Spanish influence due to her marrying Philip. He led a force of over 30 men from France and captured Scarborough Castle, only to be arrested 3 days later. Still, this event led to England declaring war against France, a war in which French forces took Calais, England's sole remaining possession on the European mainland, in 1558. That summer, Philip defeated the French at Gravelines, which led to negotiations that eventually ended the war.
Yes. My understanding is that Philip sought independence for the Duchy of Savoy, while Mary sought the return of Calais. However, when she died, this freed Philip from any obligation he might have had about Calais' restoration.
Yes, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambresis was signed between Spain, England, and France without the restoration of Calais to England. A shame, really. The good news was that it ended a costly war and led to the signing of the Edinburgh Treaty in 1560 between England and Scotland, which provided for complete French withdrawal from Scotland and gained international recognition of me as the legitimate Queen of England.
I'd like to switch gears a bit and talk about your love life. Well, or lack of one.
What does that mean?
Just that from the start of your reign, it was expected that you would marry. But you never did, though receiving many offers for your hand.
If you do not mind, I prefer not to talk about my private life.
Fair enough. But as Queen of England, especially in those days, the Queen was a public figure, and that included part of her private life.
If you insist. I had a number of suitors throughout my reign, and did consider several of them. Still, it was a serious matter, as I did not want to lose power as Mary had with Philip, and I did not want my choice of a husband to provoke political instability or worse, insurrection.
In spring of 1559, it became evident to many that you were in love with your childhood friend Robert Dudley, who at the time was a married man.
Hogwash! I loved to horse ride, and would spend many an hour riding fast through the palace grounds, which terrified my counselors, who feared that I would seriously injure or kill myself. Robert was my master of the horse, one of the most accomplished horsemen in England, and one of the few who could match me in both speed and vigor. We rode together almost every day, which caused this ridiculous speculation about Robert and I.
It's also said that you dressed up as one of your ladies in order to secretly watch Dudley compete in a shooting match.
People just love to gossip, do they not?
Yes, they do. Still, your friendship with Dudley was not looked upon favorably, and when Dudley's wife died from a fall down a flight of stairs, many suspected him to have arranged her death so that he could marry you.
Well, I did seriously consider it, but my senior advisers and some conservative peers made their disapproval unmistakably clear, and it was rumored that the nobility would rise up if a marriage took place. And so, for the betterment of the realm, I chose not to marry my Robert.
Still, it's been reported that throughout your life, Robert remained at the center of your emotional life. And when he remarried in 1568, you supposedly reacted with repeated scenes of displeasure and lifelong hatred toward his new wife.
And why would I not hate that she-wolf? She became involved with Robert when she was still married. And you know what? She was related to me, my mother's sister's granddaughter. So it seems she inherited the promiscuousness of her grandmother, Mary Boleyn, who slept with my father when he was married to Catherine of Aragon. How my mother was part of that family, I will never know.
Anyhow, marriage negotiations constituted a key element of your foreign policy. You reportedly turned down the hand of Queen Mary's husband, Philip II of Spain, and negotiated for several years to marry his cousin, Archduke Charles of Austria, well, until relations with the Habsburgs had deteriorated in 1569. In 1570, you reportedly considered marriage to Henry, Duke of Anjou, who later became Henry III of France, the fourth son of Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, who was 18 or so years younger than you. And 9 years later, in 1579, it was now his younger brother's turn to court you, Francis, Duke of Anjou, formerly Duke of Alençon, who was 24 years of age, while you were 46.
Oh, how I wished at times to be free to fall in love and marry without concern for its political ramifications, but that was not the life I was born to have. I do have to admit that I was quite fond of Francis, and despite our age difference, we enjoyed each other's company and frequently flirted. Still, thoughts of our marriage created much controversy. He was Catholic and the son of someone the very common people considered one of the most ruthless people of the time, Catherine de' Medici. Plus, because of my age, it was commonly accepted that I would bear no heirs, which upon my death, should I marry Francis, would put a Frenchman in the throne of England.
And so, you didn't marry.
No, I did not.
By 1570, senior figures in government privately accepted that you would not marry nor name a successor.
Good for them. My silence on naming a successor strengthened my own political security, for I knew that if I named an heir, my throne would be vulnerable to a coup. remembering how I, myself, was used as a focus of plots against my half-sister Queen Mary.
Your unmarried status inspired a cult of virginity. I mean, were you a virgin? Or were you just referred to as one? I mean, because you had not been married.
Why, Dan, where are your manners? A proper woman should never tell of her age or of her sexual encounters. And I was married. As I spoke before Parliament, I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England.
Fair enough. You know, I'd now like to focus our chat on Mary, Queen of Scots.
Do we have to?
Yes, we do, as her tale is interwoven with yours. As I understand it, she was your cousin, the granddaughter of your father's older sister Margaret, and seen by many Catholics as the legitimate heir to the throne of England.
Yes. Mary Stuart's claim to my throne was a perennial pain in my royal ass. She ascended to the Scottish throne 6 days after her birth, when her father, King James V, King of Scots, died. In 1543, when Mary was 6 months old, the Treaty of Greenwich was signed, which promised that at the age of 10, Mary would marry my younger half-brother Edward, thus uniting the thrones of Scotland and England.
Ah, the intrigue of arranged royal marriages. Or as Tina Turner sang, you know, what's love got to do with it? Anyhow, Scotland eventually rejected the treaty. An alliance between Scotland and France was renewed.
Yes. This prompted my father to mount a series of raids on Scottish and French territory, which, coupled with turmoil inside Scotland, caused Scotland to turn to the French for help.
And in the French, they found welcome. King Henry II proposed to unite France and Scotland by marrying Mary to his 3-year-old son, the Dauphin Francis. This was accepted, and the 5-year-old Mary was sent to France to spend the next 13 years at the French court. On April 4th, 1558, Mary signed what was then a secret agreement bequeathing Scotland and her claim to England to the French crown if she died without issue. And 20 days later, she married the Dauphin.
When King Henry II of France died in 1559 from injuries he sustained in a joust, a death which Nostradamus, another Chatting with History guest, is said to have predicted, the 15-year-old Francis became King of France, with Mary, age 16, as his queen consort.
But the marriage and Francis's reign didn't last long. In December of 1560, Francis died, and his mother, Catherine de' Medici, became regent of the late king's 10-year-old brother, Charles IX, who inherited the French throne.
Yes, it is said that Mary was grief-stricken. Whatever. Anyway, she returned to Scotland 9 months after his death, and that is when my problems with her increased.
Mary returned to Scotland, and being a Catholic, right away ran afoul of a rising Protestant population. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who quickly became so unpopular that he was murdered. And 3 months later, she again married, this time to a man suspected of killing her previous husband.
Such a scandal. For a supposedly bright woman, Mary sure made a lot of errors in judgment. Mary was imprisoned, and Scottish lords forced her to abdicate in favor of her son James, who was just 13 months old. Anyway, Mary escaped imprisonment in 1568 and fled across the border into England, seeking support from me, of all people.
Yeah, I mean, talk about errors in judgment. Reportedly, your first instinct was to restore her monarchy, but that you and your council instead decided to play it safe. So, I mean, rather than risk returning Mary to Scotland with an English army, or perhaps worse, sending her to France and the Catholic enemies of England, Mary was detained in England and imprisoned for the next 19 years.
Unfortunately, just as I was the focus of Protestants seeking to rebel against my half-sister Queen Mary, Mary Stuart became the focus of Catholics seeking to unseat me. In 1569, there was a major Catholic uprising in North England having the goal to free Mary and put her on my throne. Making matters worse, Pope Pius V, believing this revolt successful, issued a papal bull in 1570 declaring me to be a heretic and pretender, excommunicating me and releasing all my subjects from any allegiance to me. Can you imagine? A papal bull.
Well, I mean, there's still a lot of bull coming out of the Vatican these days. I mean, even with a new pope. Anyhow, much to the Pope's disappointment, the revolt failed, and over 750 rebels were executed on your orders. In addition, in 1581, attempts to convert English subjects to Catholicism with the intent to withdraw them from their allegiance to you was made a treasonable offense, carrying the death penalty and resulting in a number of missionary priests from seminaries on the European continent being put to death.
Absolutely. I had had it with the meddling of Rome, and the more they meddled, the more I was convinced that England should be a Protestant nation.
You know, Catholic plots against you continued, and while Mary may not have been aware or involved in every one of them, members of your council keenly assembled a case against her.
That they did. At first, I resisted calls to put Mary to death, but by late 1586, I was persuaded to sanction her trial and execution on the evidence of letters that were written during one of the plots against me. On February 8th, 1587, Mary was beheaded.
To this day, there's question about whether you had actually ordered the execution, had signed the warrant for her death, but had asked for the warrant not to be dispatched, and had shown sincere remorse for the execution of Mary.
Whatever. She was gone, and no longer the focus of uprisings against my crown. So, let us close our chatting about Mary Stuart, shall we?
Yes, we shall. When you first inherited the throne, Spain, ruled by your late half-sister's husband, Philip II, was a supporter of you and an ally in a war against France. But later on in your reign, Spain became an enemy.
Yes. However, even in the beginning, Philip was not to be trusted, as I sensed he was only after my crown. And this, in particular, led me not to pursue marriage with him, aside from any interest I might have had in Robert Dudley.
Things with Spain became particularly adversarial in 1585, when England entered into a treaty with Dutch Protestants who were fighting Spanish Catholics in their country.
That is true. Spain at the time controlled part of the Low Countries, and the European intrigue increased when Philip formed an alliance with the French Catholic League. This extended Spanish influence along the Channel coast of France, where the Catholic League was strong and exposed England to invasion. The 1585 Treaty of Nonsuch with the Dutch marked the beginning of the Anglo-Spanish War, which lasted until the Treaty of London in 1604.
Another contributing factor to the war was being played out on the high seas and in the New World.
In 1562, Sir John Hawkins began trading with Spanish colonies in the West Indies, and while we considered it trade, the Spanish considered it smuggling. Then, in 1568, a slaving expedition led by Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake was surprised by the Spanish, and several ships were captured or sunk near Veracruz, Mexico. In 1569, we detained several treasure ships sent by Spain to supply their army in the Netherlands, and after this, both Drake and Hawkins intensified their privateering as a way to break the Spanish monopoly on Atlantic trade.
In August 1586, Drake sailed for the West Indies and sacked Santo Domingo and captured both Cartagena de Indias and St. Augustine in Florida. In October, Drake landed in Galicia in northwest Spain and sacked two cities. And in April 1587, as Philip II was planning an invasion of England, he suffered a setback when Drake burned 37 Spanish ships in the harbor at Cadiz.
Still, Philip would not be deterred, and the execution of Mary Stuart just made him more determined to invade England and put a Catholic on the throne. So, with the backing of the Pope, Philip assembled a fleet of about 130 ships containing 8,000 soldiers and 18,000 sailors. And in May 1588, the Armada set sail for Netherlands to pick up additional Spanish troops for their invasion.
But that didn't happen. On daybreak on the 21st of July, the English fleet engaged the Armada for the first time north of Plymouth, England. This was followed by several days of skirmishes that basically were unproductive by either side. At midnight on July 28th, the British attacked once more by setting alight 8 fireships, sacrificing regular warships by filling them with pitch, brimstone, some gunpowder, and tar, and cast them downwind among the closely anchored vessels of the Armada. And while no Spanish ships were burned, it did result in much of the Armada scattering in confusion.
But that allowed us to engage and drive them off at Gravelines, where the Duke of Medina Sidonia, commander-in-chief of the Armada, tried to reform his fleet. All told, 5 Spanish ships were lost, and many others were severely damaged. What was left of the Armada moved north away from the French coast and up the eastern coast of England towards Scotland, pursued for a time by our fleet.
On August 2nd, the English called off their pursuit, but the damage was done. The Spanish were suffering from thirst and exhaustion, and their commander made the decision to sail around Scotland and Ireland into the North Atlantic and towards Spain. And this proved to be a disaster, as the Armada was ravaged by storms, high wind, and navigational errors. In the end, 67 ships and less than 10,000 men survived, with many near death from disease and eventually dying in Spain.
Overall, it was quite the victory for us. It boosted national pride for years and made me appear to be quite the capable leader in a time of war.
Still, it did not end the war. The Spanish continued to hold the Netherlands, the threat of invasion remained, and a number of subsequent English armadas proved unsuccessful. Plus, there was unrest and rebellion in Ireland, the tax burden grew heavy, and the English economy was hit by poor harvests and the cost of war. Prices rose, standard of living fell, repression of Catholics intensified, and there was a decline in the public's affection for you.
Yes, those were difficult times. In all fairness to myself, my governing body, the Privy Council, changed in the 1590s. The most important politicians had died, and there was now noteworthy factional strife that had not existed before, and my personal authority was lessening.
Also during this time, your health began to fail you. Plus, in late 1602 and early 1603, a number of friends, including Catherine Howard and Catherine Carey, Lady Knollys, died, plunging you into a severe depression.
Yes. I fell sick and remained in a settled and unremoved melancholy, passing away on March 24th, 1603, at Richmond Palace, having reigned for 45 years. My funeral procession drew multitudes of adoring subjects, and I was interred in Westminster Abbey in a tomb I share with my half-sister Mary. I was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son, who became James I, King of England and Ireland.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. You know, before we leave, I'd like to spend a little time talking about what's referred to as the Elizabethan era, often depicted as the golden age in English history, a renaissance that inspired national pride through classical ideas, international expansion, and naval triumph over a hated Spanish foe, and a time when England was economically healthier, more expansive, and more optimistic than at any time in the previous 1,000 years.
Yes, it was a fun time to be English.
The Elizabethan era is also a time that saw the flowering of poetry, music, and literature, being most famous for theater, as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and others composed plays that broke free of England's past style of theater.
Again, it was a fun time. Personally, I loved music and could play the lute and the virginal, a harpsichord-like instrument. I enjoyed musical entertainments, encouraging musicians and composers, and I loved to dance. Why, I even had a dance routine that I did every morning to keep myself fit. Oh, and I sang. I also loved watching plays, masks, and other dramatic performances, and even had my own company of actors called the Queen's Players, who would often perform plays for me and others. Plus, some considered me an early fashionista.
Well then, I guess you should be doing some commercials for Marshalls.
What?
Never mind. Anyhow, we've just about run out of time, and I'd like to thank you, Queen Elizabeth I of England and Ireland, Liz, for coming on the show. As is customary, are there any parting words you'd like to leave with our audience?
But of course, what queen does not like to address her subjects? And it's been such a long time. To begin with, I ruled England, one of the most powerful nations in the world at the time, for 45 years, and I did it without a man. Yes, I had many male advisors and counselors, and could not do without a number of them, but ultimately I wore the crown, and you might say the English pound stopped with me. Now, I was a woman, but let me assure you that I was not compensated any less than I would have had I been king and not queen. There was none of that, as a sovereign was a sovereign. To think that in 2013, and in the United States, a country that started out as an English colony, and which claims to strive for equality, that there would be the notion that a woman is not worth the same as a man for similar work is preposterous, and that there are women who agree that they are worth less than a man is even more disconcerting. Why, if I were ruling that nation, there would be a lot of heads rolling. Second, I was raised a Protestant, yet many of those in my court and many of the rulers of European nations were Catholic. When I became queen, I attempted to find common ground between Catholics and Protestants, since both have the same God, Jesus, and that any dispute was over how to pray and serve him, matters that I considered trivial. Well, it seems that not many felt these differences trivial, and were willing to do battle to prove their way was favored by God. Imagine! And then there was the Pope in Rome meddling into the affairs of state, mostly to enrich the Church. Around the time of my reign, Europe was plagued with wars between countries and within countries between Protestants and Catholics. Is there any wonder that there is so much division among Christians today? Lastly, while my support of public theater might be debated, I loved music and dance and the theater, and my court and I were frequently entertained, and perhaps my enjoyment passed down to my people, who experienced a renaissance of sorts, delighting in plays and poetry and other artistic endeavors. As queen, I came to realize that the character of a nation is as much a reflection of its victories on the field of battle as it is of its arts and culture. Again, it is especially perplexing and troubling that in 21st century America, there are powerful people who seek to wage war against the arts, cutting funds from programs in schools like dance and music and theater, cutting endowments to organizations that promote the arts, and going after public broadcasting that provides educational programming for children. Now, I do not know why this is happening. Perhaps it is those damn Puritans, a most unjoyful group of Protestants. Regardless, as I said before, none of this would be happening if I ruled America. If you ask me, if there's no rocking and rolling, maybe there should be some heads that are rolling.
Words of wisdom from Queen Elizabeth I of England and Ireland, one of the greatest sovereigns in Western history. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm with Liz in regard to what I see as a war on the arts in this country. A war that is being waged by the same folk bringing us the war on science, on women, and all sorts of other wars in order for them to foist their anal restrictive social and religious values on greater society. And while I don't have an answer to these wars, I must admit that there's something appealing about Liz's solution of having heads roll. Anyhow, until our next Chatting with History, this is Dan Gersten, reminding all of you that our American culture and society is not enhanced, and if anything, it's diminished by going after music appreciation schools, ballet and other dance programs, or Big Bird. Thank you for watching.
Talk to me.